Donc David Erritzoe, donc de Londres.
David Erritzoe from London, from the Imperial College in London. He's a professor of psychiatry. He's a clinician in the NHS Hospital of St. Charles and worked a lot on dopaminergic neurotransmission, especially on D3 dopaminergic receptors, and particular in alcohol, opioid, heroin, and cocaine addictions. He's now doing multimodal imaging studies assessing the white matter, especially to cancel the neurotransmission of dopamine.
We'll give a talk about serotonergic psychedelics in affective and addictive disorders in theory and in practice.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for that kind introduction, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you guys for being here this afternoon to hear about psychedelics. So I think we just switched orders, so it was Matt Johnson who was supposed to speak now, but I'll just start while Matt is finding his Skype link over in Johns Hopkins. He's in Baltimore. So yes, I've been working in different aspects of addiction. When it comes to the psychedelic research, it has mainly been focused on affective disorder, namely depression, from what we have been doing. But we have been doing a wide range of other research in addiction in our center with different molecular and functional brain imaging techniques. So, but what I will be talking mostly about today is this quite a popular topic at the moment in psychiatry and in neuroscience, which is the psychedelic science that we are involved in at Imperial. We were lucky to be able to set up the first psychedelic. Let me just see where it is that I point. It might be this one. Anyway, I don't know how. I don't know how I use it to point. Maybe this one. Yeah, this one. Yeah. So a few years back, we were able to set up the first center for psychedelic research at a university at Imperial, and then soon after, Johns Hopkins set up an even bigger center. But it was mainly Johns Hopkins who opened this field together with people in Zurich, and also later on Imperial came on 12 years ago to start this work, mainly led by David Nutt and Robin Card-Harris. So very recently we added to our center a research clinic, which is called the Cypress Clinic. So now we have a center and a clinic dedicated to psychopharmacology research with a focus on psychedelics. Just a little introduction, what compounds we are talking about. So the main ones that are in focus at the moment is psilocybin, which is a classic serotonergic phenethylamine psychedelic, and also DMT. So this is a bit longer lasting in the body and the brain than DMT. Then you have the very long lasting LSD, and then also mescaline. And those four are typically referred to as the classic serotonergic psychedelics. And as you can see, their molecular structure is quite similar to serotonin, the endogenous neurotransmitter itself. And that also informs, to some degree, their pharmacology that you'll see on the next slide. But those are not the only compounds in focus at the moment. There are also associated compounds that are not classic serotonergic psychedelics, but are related and also appear on this slide. I will say that the three main in game at the moment are DMT and psilocybin, those two in particular, and then LSD. Mescaline is less studied in the modern era of psychedelic science. As you can see here, if you take the brew ayahuasca, which come from the Amazonian jungle shamanistic culture, has been used for thousands of years in ceremonies in South America, and it still is used. People are also traveling there, as a big tourism going on because people are curious about these experiences. Then after oral intake of ayahuasca, which basically is a brew containing the psychedelic compound DMT, together with some other natural occurring compounds, MAO inhibitors, harmalins, that come from other plant products. So combined, that makes the DMT orally active because it's not degraded in the gut because of the MAO inhibitors, preventing it from being broken down in the gut. However, if you want to get the pure DMT, then it's not orally active because it will be broken down in the gut. So then it needs to be smoked or infused, which is what we do. We use it intravenously in our trials at Imperial and other places. You can see that mescaline is much longer lasting, so is LSD, which makes it not super practical because then your sessions with full doses, people will be having these experiences for the whole day and into the evening, so it's not very practical. Psilocybin, similar oral ingestion of psilocybin, similar duration of effects to ayahuasca. But there are other atypical psychedelics, as we could call them. They have used different terminologies for these compounds. So one of them that is also being therapeutically developed, actually is being developed ahead of the psychedelics. That's MDMA or ecstasy. So MDMA, this molecule that you see now is covered here, it's often referred to an empathogen. So it's not a classic psychedelic. It doesn't cause all the different aspects of the experience that are characteristic for the classic psychedelics, but it overlaps. And that's also being developed as this new fusion model where you combine pharmacological induced psychological experience together with different models of psychotherapy. That's the same idea. Whereas with MDMA therapy, there's a bit more action happening in the room because you can actually speak to people during sessions, which we don't do much during the psychedelics. Other compounds that are related, ibogaine, very, very long lasting. Ketamine, typically used in infusion, but also more recently by Johnson & Johnson, developed the nasal spray Spravato, used in depression. So these compounds are associated, and we could refer to them as atypical psychedelics because they do overlap in their effects. And both ibogaine and ketamine, to some degree, are dissociative drugs. So the nature of the experiences are a bit different. Then let's go to this. So in the synapse, in the brain, you have the serotonergic system, which is one out of many neurotransmitter systems. As you all know, there are 14 different receptors in that specific system. And some of them are called the serotonin 2A, so that's just one out of the receptors sit postsynaptically. It's sitting quite prominently in cortical areas of the brain. It's very preserved through evolution, this specific 2A receptor. And the interesting thing is here, and that is also why I showed you before that the psychedelics in the classic serotonergic psychedelics in molecular structure are very similar to serotonin, because that also means that they mimic to some degree what serotonin is doing by directly stimulating receptors such as the 2A. Whereas other drugs like MDMA, they work more presynaptically over here at the same site at the SSRIs. So that's on the production side of the synapse, where you have the release and the reuptake and the degradation and so on. That's happening over here, and that's why these drugs can also impact the transmission of serotonin and the synthesis and so on, whereas the psychedelics don't tend to do that because they work more directly over on the other side of the synapse. Other things we know is that the more they occupy this 2A receptor, the more intense is the experience. And also, the higher affinity they have, the more potent they are. And if we selectively block them, we also take away the psychedelic experience, at least mainly. There are more studies coming out that are going more in molecular details, what's happening exactly on the 2A receptor. But this is sort of overall how it looks at the moment, how we understand these drugs. In terms of the effects, psychedelic means mind or soul manifesting or revealing. It comes from Greek. And as you can see, with these quite complex and slightly abstract terms, some of them, it's very, very, very different experiences that these drugs induce compared to other drugs we are used to, like opiates, alcohol, stimulants. So they typically create a profound sense of unity or oneness or connectedness. They often lead to a profound sense of insight, meaningfulness, even spiritual experiences, and a blissful state. So all that is very good and positive, obviously. Even they cause a sense of sacredness, deeply positive felt mood, which is obviously part of the reason why we are developing these drugs therapeutically, and also paradoxicality. Things can be more than one thing at the same time. Time and space are there's transcendence of time and space. It's difficult to coin or express or explain the experiences, so that's why we refer to ineffability. All these things are very, very different from other drugs that you know of. And those ones over here, we often refer to as the psychological peak experience, even beyond psychedelic research, back from Abraham Maslow and similar colleagues back in the days. They were studying these experiences, mystical type experiences, and in some of the altered state of consciousness measurements, they are referred to as oceanic boundariness, but that doesn't matter too much. More think about psychological peak experience or mystical type experiences. That is quite uniquely produced by these drugs in terms of drugs. Other drugs don't produce that to that degree at all. Other profound religious experiences, deep meditation and so on can also overlap with these experiences, not surprisingly. In terms of their safety, if we look at the list or the ranking of harms of different compounds, you have alcohol scoring highest. When you look at the total harm, if you look at only the harm to the individual, alcohol drops down to number 4 after crystal meth, heroin, and crack cocaine. Whereas down in the more interesting end of the spectrum, when it comes to this talk and what we are doing, you have the psychedelics, LSD, mushroom, psilocybin, and also MDMA down in the less harmful end. And part of the reason for that is that they are not addictive. They are physiologically very safe. So the classic serotonergic psychedelics, there are synthetic novel psychedelics that are not as safe, but the classic ones are very safe. So that means there's a wide, safe window of dose that can be ingested without causing harm to people. Where they are tricky is more in that they can be overwhelming. They can cause some degree of anxiety. They can be challenging. Typically they are, which is again very opposite from other drugs. If you think about cocaine, alcohol, heroin, they're not very challenging. They're very pleasant for most people. They cause a lot of problems, addiction, they destroy a lot of organs and so on, but it's not the psychological effects that are difficult for those drugs. So it's a bit the other way around with psychedelics. The only physiological things to be aware of is that they can cause transient nausea and headache. Ayahuasca in particular causes a lot of nausea. DMT on its own doesn't really, but they can cause some nausea, and headache is also typical during the experience. So this is a summary of where the field is at the moment. So there are interesting results coming from psychedelic naive people who are healthy, who have been going through very prepared, carefully screened, carefully prepared, carefully guided and supported during the experience, and then psychologically integrated afterwards. Then people increase in well-being. We can see good pilot data in OCD. We are now setting up a new study at Imperial that will start in a few months with OCD treatment with psilocybin in a sort of moderate dose. We can see that end-of-life distress, also with measures of anxiety, depression, are improving, and addiction that I'll come back to, depression I'll come back to in a moment. So a lot of positive, promising, potential benefits coming from these compounds in a therapeutic context. Our first trial was done a few years back, was published in Lancet Psychiatry. As you can see, this is self-rated depression scores with the quits, and they were moderate to severe. Only 2 people were moderate. The rest of them at baseline were severely depressed, and they were treatment resistant. So that was our first open label, no control condition, proof of concept trial to see whether it was safe to give these drugs to people suffering depression after we had for years been giving them in different brain imaging studies to healthy people. And we could see quite significant and quite profound antidepressant effect in this sample. You can see these 20 patients, they dropped. This is the bold average of the depression scores. And you can see after this single intervention here, there was still significant improvements in the group, also even at 6-month follow-up. And that is quite interesting. Obviously, it will look better when you do an open label trial early on in development of a treatment. So when you scale it up and time goes, these results won't be as impressive. But this basically meant that companies and investors were putting money into the space and are now conducting first phase 2, now phase 3 trials. The first phase 3 trial just came out with the first results 2 weeks ago. Compass Pathway, again, showed very promising results on a large scale in 300 plus patients. So basically this study led to that. It was the first depression study with a psychedelic intervention in 50 years. Another thing that came out of that study, which is basically not only for that study, but actually goes for most of the studies listed here. And that is very interesting. So there are two factors. One thing is that long-lasting effects after single intervention, even longer than what you see with ketamine infusions. The other thing is that the nature of the experience, so what people actually feel, the more of a psychological peak experience or mystical type experience people get during these therapy sessions, the better are the later outcomes. We don't know if that's causal, but there is a link in most studies so that we can see that acute state is predictive of the outcome, which is, together with the long-lasting effects, really suggesting quite a different paradigm to what we are used to in mental health, where we give people medications every day for a long time, and if we take it away, the effects tend to diminish or go away. And also that the nature of the experience don't play a particular role. It's not that there is any particular experience from normal, conventional pharmacological treatment in psychiatry, apart from the side effects. Then a few things. First of all, how would this be scalable? How do we make a bigger trial? Compass did that with 25 milligram and compared to 10 and 1 milligram. That is what I just referred to, just came out with promising results. Another thing is, what about the mechanisms? How does this differ from conventional SSRI treatment, for instance? So we chose a gold standard SSRI that come out very, very well in meta-analysis. And we had to treat for several weeks, obviously, because otherwise it would be an unfair comparison. So SSRI needs to be on board for a while for that to be. So therefore we could design the trial like this. You'll see, So basically, again, very well screened. First-degree relatives with psychosis was screened out. Any history of psychosis screened out. People, very careful history taking, several preparation visits, and then guided, supported in a setting, in a context that was specially designed for this kind of intervention. So with dim light, music in the ears, in the room, and guides in the room for hours. So and there's a BBC documentary at the moment about our trial that might be difficult to see from outside the UK, unfortunately. But basically, it was also published in New England Journal of Medicine earlier this year. And basically, the design was that we randomized 59 patients. So either if they went in the arm to the left, they got the real psilocybin treatment, and they got it twice with 3 weeks intervals. So they got 2 sessions of 25 milligram psilocybin, and then they received placebo. So instead of escitalopram, they just got placebo capsules every day for 6 weeks. In the other arm, they got placebo sessions with a very, very tiny dose of 1 milligram that doesn't really give any effects. And then they got the real escitalopram. So that was the design of this trial. And basically, here are the results. So as you can see, the primary outcome that was predefined, QIDS, which is this self-rated measure of depression, it didn't statistically significantly separate the two groups in terms of depression outcome. However, all the other Hamilton depression, Madras, Beck's depression inventory, so other measures of depression, they did separate, and they did favor psilocybin in this trial compared to SSRI treatment with escitalopram for 6 weeks. And all other measures also favored psilocybin. Also, there's a very quick onset of the psilocybin experiences, whereas the escitalopram takes longer, which is expected. In terms of remission and response to treatment, you can also see much higher scores for psilocybin, did significantly better here, 52 2-week remission versus 15, and so on, with remission and response rates for the two conditions, again favoring psilocybin condition. Here's a quote from one of the patients: "The way I felt during and after my first dose was life-changing in the sense that it completely crystallized the root of my depression." which was characterized by an intense and debilitating self-doubt stemming from perceived failures throughout my life. And it allowed me to let go of it entirely, realize my worth, relearn how to start feeling positive emotions again. And during the trip, I felt I was led around and reintroduced to happiness, love, charity, and gratitude. And finally connect with family and friends again after feeling alone and isolated for many years. So that's one of the quotes from one of the patients, not very atypical. I know it sounds like great advertisement for psychedelics, but nevertheless, that is from the trial. Now I jump into the territory of Matt Johnson, so I actually think I'll just go extremely quickly through it so that you have seen it before you see Matt present, because he's going to focus more on addiction. So basically, when you review the first era of psychedelic science, a lot of it was LSD treatment for alcohol addiction back in the 1950s, 60s. So when you do meta-analysis on those studies, there's significant improvements in the LSD. There was mainly LSD used in those days for alcohol treatment, and they come out better than the control condition at early time points. Also interestingly, the founder of AA, Bill Wilson, he actually was treated with psychedelic therapy himself. So when he actually managed to get well treated and remain abstinent, he was also trying to integrate psychedelic into the AA model, because this higher power, this profound, the spirituality, is associated a bit with the 12 steps, and that's because Bill Wilson, most likely because Bill Wilson himself was treated with psychedelic assisted therapy, but it didn't enter the model, as you all know. Modern proof of concept trial, more recently, a few years back, Bogenschutz, they tested it again in alcohol addiction, psilocybin, and you can see that these are the drinking days, heavy drinking days after 2 different sessions with psilocybin in a small pilot open label trial, a bit like our first depression trial. Another thing is that the cravings went down, and they were very, very long lasting. Long after the, you see, 36-week follow-up, cravings were much lower. One of the potential theoretical mechanisms for that has just came out a couple of weeks ago in rodents, where you can do a sort of glutamate receptor, mGluR2 receptor function, which is, if that is reduced, then it leads to impaired exit function and also leads to alcohol cravings, and that could be reversed by psilocybin in a rodent knockdown model of mGluR2. So that could explain some of that. Other work, this is just one example. There are other people who have been doing ketamine, so not a serotonergic, classic serotonergic psychedelic, but an atypical dissociative psychedelic, ketamine, also being used now being tested in addiction work, namely in alcohol addiction in Russian studies, and also by Dervaux, but also by Celia Morgan. So a lot of studies going to come with ketamine for alcohol. These are some of the experience. They overlap a bit with what we saw in the depression work. And then they are scaling that up. So there are more studies coming there. MDMA has also been tested in a pilot study, also shown good results by Ben Sessa and his teams so they are collaborators of ours also in England, and they saw here, this is standard treatment, and this is the percent of people who are drinking more than 14 units. So you can see that looks quite a lot better in the MDMA study here. Again, a proof of concept pilot trial, only 14 alcohol use disorder patients. And also here you can see that the number of units that would been drunk at 9 months following these couple of sessions with MDMA, they were much, much lower than they were at baseline. Again, a non-controlled open label trial, but again looking very interesting. This is Matt Johnson's, so I'll skip. Just to mention, ibogaine also being developed for treatment of addictions, looking quite interesting. Demrex in Miami are scaling that up. We are collaborating with them. We might do the first imaging, hopefully studies of ibogaine, how it works in the brain. And then early work in the 70s done with heroin addiction and LSD. So not only alcohol, as I mentioned before. Here are some of the quotes from the early 70s from some of the participants in that trial. Also quite good looking results in that trial of 37 patients, and there was a control in that trial. Possible mechanisms, we know we have a very flexible brain state, a lot of plasticity going on. We know that the sort of very popular neuroscience model of how the brain works and how mental health is problems are happening, having to do with prediction error model and impacts on that in the different conditions. We assume that this very plastic, flexible brain state, where we see that the functional brain networks are fusing and basically cross-communicating, might allow for a bottom-up and reshaping of these models we have of how we perceive the world. And that might be why it leads to longer lasting effects. And also why they might be working cross indications. Other things that are interesting is some concepts. We see a disconnect going to a sense of connectedness. We see avoidance going to acceptance. We can see a reduction of negative cognitive biases, and we can see one of the big 5 traits, openness, being increased. And again, the nature of the experience is predictive of that. And then we can see preclinically that there are plasticity happening with these compounds. We are now testing that in humans using PET, MR, EEG in combination to measure plasticity in the brain, try to understand how these drugs work. And this, I think I won't have time to go into, but this has to do with the sort of back from the 90s, Metzner was speculating on how these mind-altering, mind-expanding experiences can be therapeutic when you have this sort of narrowed, hijacked in addictions. And that is something that we are trying to pursue and understand better by developing new paradigms with fMRI, where we can look at cue reactivity with video cues, and we want to apply this to test the psychedelic treatment model in addiction by seeing whether we can rebroaden a hijacked and narrowed, over-focused reward spectrum in addiction. And in our pilot work, we can see that, for instance, in pathological gamblers, food cues, nature cues, they don't activate much in the reward circuits, whereas gambling cues do. So this is this hijacked reward system that we can measure with these methods. And then we want to see whether we can revert some of that with the psychedelic treatment. So that's for the future for us to investigate the mechanisms of how these drugs might work in the treatment of addiction. So I'll stop here. Oh, sorry, I have one more slide with all the different, this is just a little showcase of a lot of the studies that we are heading or setting up at Imperial. So it's quite a lot. There's anorexia nervosa with psilocybin, there's chronic pain, there's OCD, and then we are doing DMT work with short psychedelic experience with DMT infusions for depression as well. And that is now in phase 2. So we're also doing that. So, and then we have this wonderful new clinic that we are going to do a lot of the work in, hopefully, if we're allowed to. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for this very impressive talk. Is there any question in the audience? Yes? The microphone is arriving.
Is it working? It is. That was a really great talk. And I did see the BBC documentary on BBC Two. I wanted to ask 2 questions, actually. One, if that's okay. One is, how do you control for bias in the studies if you have patients who are aware of what psychedelics do? They probably know, if they are drug using, they know what the drugs would induce. So how can you control for bias when they expect this experience and then start telling you about an experience they may not actually have had if they're on the placebo? And then the second one was, there is no treatment for anorexia. So even if you did find something that was promising, which would be great, in that, how would you tackle that in that cohort of patients? They may not necessarily want to be treated.
That's a good question. I guess for the last question first, I mean, treatment like this would obviously only be if people are completely on board and have capacity to consent to engage in that treatment. And it actually looks quite good already. We have done 5 or 6 now, and it looks good. But it will be niche, I think, in anorexia, but you never know. If it actually really does something, then it might obviously sort of appeal to patients to go down that route if they want to be treated. But that's a good point. That's the same with addiction, isn't it? That you need people to be motivated for treatment. In terms of the biases, it's weird with psychedelics because we can't completely blind it. A profound mystical type psychological peak experience is what it is. It's profound. It's not easy to blind that in any form. So that's also why FDA and EMA, so the regulators, they basically advise the companies to not try and do that because it's not possible anyway. So instead doing different doses. So for instance, the full dose, a middle dose, a tiny dose, and see whether there's some degree of dose response. So that's basically the way that it's being developed. And so the other thing we can do is try to assess and collect information about what people expect, what are their intentions, how much do they know, how convinced are they from the beginning that this will totally save them, and try at least to rate that and then see if that predicts the outcomes, because that would speak to some degree of expectation effects, with placebo effects, which definitely is part of it, for sure, definitely. And with microdosing, which I didn't speak about at all, we have done a massive trial with microdosing. It really looks like it's very driven by expectations, okay? So it looks like a lot of the effects with microdosing, we can see that the predictive value of what people think they took, and when they're actually blinded, then what they actually took is 10 times higher. So it's 10 times higher, and that's in microdosing, which is completely different, tiny doses that people take repeatedly. That's incredibly popular at the moment. So far, the data is not convincing that there are beyond placebo significant proper effects of psychedelic microdosing. But what I talked about here was the full doses. It looks very good, but we can't get around that problem completely. And maybe it also doesn't matter.
Another questions in the audience?
Thank you very much for your very interesting speech. I have a question on alcohol studies. When patients take psilocybin, do they just take it like depressed patient on Spravato in a relaxing atmosphere, or do you try some kind of psychotherapy under psilocybin?
So that's a very good question. So basically, in a lot of these early pilot studies, it's very focused on the experience. That means that psychological package is typical, quite reduced, and just about preparing, supporting, and integrating the experience. However, in the addiction studies that Matt Johnson will address this, but you'll see that there are some, it is put into a model of motivational kind of therapy, and that is typically the case when it comes to the addiction work with psychedelics. Then there is, 10 sessions, and then into the sessions, they are built a couple of psychedelic interventions, but it is built onto a psychotherapy model, typically motivational therapy when it comes to the addiction. But I think Matt will address it more. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. It's time to switch to the next talk by Professor Matthew Johnson. Professor Johnson is Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He is one of the world's most published scientists on the human effects of psychedelics. He works with psychedelics since 2004. He published psychedelic safety guidelines in 2008, helping to resurrect psychedelic research. As principal investigator, he developed and published the first research on psychedelic treatment of tobacco addiction in 2014. And Professor Johnson is current president of the International Society for Research on Psychedelics. Professor Johnson.
Thank you. And thanks for the patience, everybody, as I was having technical difficulties. And so thank you for David for switching orders with me. So I'll move on with my slide presentation, Psychedelics in the Treatment of Addiction. So if you'll advance this next slide, please. Okay, so here I'm just showing you by way of disclosures that I serve as an advisor for some companies that are developing psychedelic medicines, but I'm not talking about any of their specific work or their products today. Next, please. Okay, so most of what I will mention relates to psilocybin. That's the active agent in over 200 species of mushrooms. It's pharmacologically a classic psychedelic. That's the pharmacological class that puts it in the same category as LSD, mescaline, and dimethyltryptamine. And what this means in terms of brain function is that they all serve as agonists at the serotonin 2A receptor. So that's what mechanistically defines these classic psychedelics. Next, please. So now, of course, we're in this age of enlightenment. It's been called a renaissance, but this resurgence of interest in scientific interest in psychedelics. This was an enthusiastic area of research from the 50s through the 1960s, the mid to late 1960s, but it really gave way and was sensationalized due to the public use of LSD, and there was this a conflation of the casualties that we saw under reckless use with what you get under cautious research. So as I'm showing you here, after decades of relative dormancy of scientific interest really started to surge in the early 2000s. That was around the time when I was lucky to get involved with this research. Next, please. So I'll just mention very quickly, of course, there are harms. We know of a good deal about the risks associated with these classic psychedelics. David did an excellent job describing this. I won't go into this in any detail. I will say that the one domain of potential risk that is typically there for drugs of abuse, which is not there for psilocybin and other classic psychedelics, is the potential for addiction or compulsive drug seeking. So these drugs, the classic psychedelics, can be abused, but they aren't drugs of addiction. They don't lead to compulsive drug seeking. They don't activate the mesolimbic reward system in that way. And so we're fairly confident about that. So that's important to know. Next, please. That's important to know, especially when we're using a compound with interest to treat addiction, that it's not addictive itself. That's helpful. So this is just a picture of our what the typical treatment model looks like. It's a 5 to 6 hour drug effect, and during most of that time, the person is laying on a couch wearing eye shades and wearing headphones through which music is playing. And the whole idea is to have an introspective experience. The person is told to look inward, to trust, let go, be open. And they're in the room with two guides or facilitators who the person has developed a rapport with. And if the person has any anxiety, as modeled here in this photo, one of the guides can attend to them. They can hold their hand, reassure them verbally. Next, please. Okay, so just because psychedelics, the classic psychedelics, aren't addictive themselves, why would we expect them to treat addiction? Next, please. One line of evidence is that our anthropological studies showing that ceremonial use of psychedelics to be linked with addiction recovery. So there are a number of reports of peyote use within the Native American church. Peyote contains mescaline, which is a classic psychedelic, and it's used sacramentally. It's legally protected in the United States, this use by the Native American church, and a number of early reports documented to the addiction recovery stories, largely alcohol-related, but also others, addiction recovery associated with that, with peyote use amongst Native American populations. Also, there are reports like this with ayahuasca, the South American sacrament containing dimethyltryptamine. And so reports of this regarding ayahuasca use addiction recovery, both in South American indigenous societies as well as syncretic religions based on South American religions. So next, please. Next slide, please. There we go. And so David showed these, so I won't spend long on this. That older research, the meta-analysis, as David explained, showed that there was a clear signal for a rather large effect, looking at LSD treating alcoholism, essentially doubling the odds, as I'm showing you here, that the patient would be improved at the first follow-up compared to the control conditions. Next, please. And then this was one study that was published using LSD to treat heroin addiction. There were some limitations. The LSD group had a short inpatient stay that was not there for the other group. Nonetheless, there were many strengths. There was biological verification of urine to verify abstinence and long-term outcomes. So here I'm showing you substantially higher outcome abstinence rates 1 year or 12 months after treatment. So better success rates with LSD looked very promising, certainly needs to be followed up on. Next slide, please. So we moved into, in the modern era, well, about 13 years ago or so, I decided to look into addiction and using psilocybin to treat addiction, and I landed on smoking cessation, so tobacco, of course, nicotine. It's a good model system of addiction. It's very quantifiable. It's easy to biologically verify abstinence, but also it's beyond being a good model system of addiction that lends itself to rigorous study. It's also kind of a problem itself. I'm showing you here the number of deaths in the United States estimated from tobacco each year, almost 500,000. Many times larger than all of the other substances combined. All of the illicit drugs barely show up on the same figure visually compared to tobacco in terms of deaths. And most smokers want to quit, but yet the approved treatments have relatively low long-term success rates. Next slide, please. Okay, so we conducted a feasibility study, a small study just to see whether this was a promising area. So this was an open label, 15 people that wanted to quit smoking, that had tried previous times, multiple times to quit smoking. Next, please. These were the demographics. The important things were they had been smoking on average over 30 years and smoked on average almost 20 cigarettes a day, almost a full pack a day. So these were not lightweights. These were serious long-term smokers. Next, please. And the design was, again, it was open label. There were 3 psilocybin sessions, but those psilocybin sessions were embedded in a 15-week protocol where most of the meetings were the talk therapy was based on cognitive behavioral therapy for quitting smoking. So this is sort of a standard approach. Of course, it probably underlies most smoking cessation modalities, generally cognitive behavioral therapy. And so we had the target quit date on the first psilocybin session was on the same day as the target quit date. And that was a moderate dose of psilocybin. And then they had a second and third dose of psilocybin spread out over several sessions after that, 2 weeks and then 8 weeks later at a higher dose, a slightly higher dose. And then, yep, that's it. And next slide, please. And here are some, one way of looking at the results. This is breath carbon monoxide, so a metric through a breath sample of whether you've been smoking recently. And so there's clearly a reduction, a large reduction before and after their quit attempt, which is before and after their first psilocybin session, as I'm showing you here. Next, please. And this is another way to look at the data. This is the percent of participants who are biologically verified as abstinent for the previous 7 days. both by carbon monoxide and by urine cotinine methods of verification and by self-report. So at 6 months, that held up to 80%, which is extremely high, and at 30 months, which is on average about 2.5 years, that held up to 60%. So these are very large success rates, although it is a small pilot, open label pilot study. Next, please. This is one way to just, but even though it's still open label and we can't make definitive conclusions about its success, the results are worthy of follow-up, and that's the whole point. One of the major points of a pilot study is this even worth further investment? And that answer is absolutely, because I'm showing you relative success rates here. Now, this isn't really a fair comparison. I'm drawing success rates from this pilot trial to studies done, representative values of average success rates in the literature. So they're drawn from different samples, but just to give you a sense of why we're excited about the general magnitude of results, you can see on the far right, our results at 12-month continuous success rates are over 50%, which is much larger than all the other forms of treatment that have been reported. And I should say continuous success, what I'm showing here, is the most stringent, which means even a single cigarette during that 12-month period would mean you're not counted as a success. So that's the most conservative way to look at the data. Next, please. And we did a qualitative analysis, asked these people 2.5 years on average after their treatment how it worked. Did the psilocybin help, and if so, how? And here's what they said to those questions. They said yes, and it caused a persisting sense of interconnectedness, all curiosity. It reduced smoking withdrawal symptoms compared to previous quit attempts. There were increases in altruism and appreciation for aesthetics, and there were also insights into self-identity and idiosyncratic personal reasons for smoking. Next, please. And I won't read all of these, but these are just some quotes kind of emblematic when we ask people how this helped you, how the session kind of helped you quit smoking. One person said, primarily, I would say it made me understand that my identity is this construct. So there, I think, what this means is their identity, being a smoker is part of that identity. Next, I've learned how to be more grateful, which is probably the most important thing, et cetera. I won't go on. But now we're in the midst of a randomized comparative efficacy trial where we're taking 100 people and randomizing 50 to have a single psilocybin session, so just one psilocybin session, versus a standard course of nicotine patch treatment. Both groups have the same cognitive behavioral therapy. Next, please. So the trial is ongoing, but 61 people have gotten to the 1-year follow-up. So I'll show you a snapshot of the data as they are right now. The demographics for those people, the important things are, they smoke on average 16, 17 cigarettes a day, and years smoking over 25. So these, again, are not lightweights, all had several previous serious quit attempts. Next, please. And so these are the success rates right now in terms of 7-day point prevalence, abstinence. For the 31 people in the psilocybin group at 12 months after their quit attempt, 59% are biologically verified abstinent compared to 28 in the patch group, which is pretty good for the patch, but nonetheless is being obviously dwarfed by what we're seeing with psilocybin now. So these are not official results because it's an open label trial and it's ongoing, but just to see where we're at now, it's still looking very promising. Next, please. And one bit of data I'll show you, we're also doing some fMRI before and after their quit attempt to understand potential biological mechanisms of efficacy. I'm showing you here some behavioral data. I don't think we have enough data to make sense of the imaging data, but some of those imaging tasks are done in conjunction with behavioral tasks. And this is a behavioral task called the MSIT, multi-source interference task. It measures one's ability to maintain so-called cognitive control, how to maintain implement emit a prepotent, a response, but resist a naturalistic automatic temptation to do something else, a distractor. That's essentially what this task gets at. And you see the day after quitting smoking with psilocybin compared to quitting with nicotine patch, the control condition, that there's a significant improvement in cognitive control. This might be this might be showing us what I sometimes see anecdotally from these participants, in that they're more mindful, that they have this awareness about having quit. They're not, if they have a craving, they can kind of tell themselves, oh, but I quit smoking recently, I'm going to be fine. Just wait it out for a few minutes, sort of like not giving in to temptations, not falling into that automaticity. Okay, next, please. But we'll see if those results hold up as the study continues. And recently we received the good news that this line of research with smoking cessation is going to continue with funding from the U.S. federal government. As far as we know, it's the first time the U.S. Government has funded a treatment study administering a classic psychedelic for therapeutic ends in the modern era since the late 60s. So we're excited to do that. It's going to be a multi-site study with both NYU, New York University, and University of Alabama, Birmingham as other sites conducting this work. Next, please. And then I believe, as also mentioned by David, so it's not just this smoking work. Extremely similar parallel line of inquiry has been at play with Michael Bogenschutz. He started this work at University of New Mexico and published this pilot study using psilocybin for alcohol use disorder. He showed in 10 patients a large reduction in self-reported drinking days and heavy drinking days. Instead of cognitive behavioral therapy, he's using motivational enhancement therapy, which includes motivational interviewing. These are methods for working more with patients who are more ambiguous. They're not necessarily coming into the trial. They'll need to have a goal to quit, but they're kind of working with that ambivalence. So a little different than the CBT approach we've taken in our work. But they showed promising results, and we are told that Michael has recently finished that. So there are results somewhere, but they're not publicly available yet. They're working on getting them published. So everyone, I think, is anxiously awaiting results from that follow-up trial of 100 people that Michael has conducted now at New York University, following up on these data. Next, please. And future direction. So wrapping it up here, the big question here is, what there has to be either this is snake oil and we're incorrect about this working for these various disorders, or there's some transdiagnostic mechanisms that help to explain why it would work for, different forms of addiction, why it would work for addiction and depression, why it would work for, cancer-related distress. And so what are those transdiagnostic mechanisms? One kind of broad way to look at it that needs more scientific translation is, I referred to in Michael Pollan's book as the dope slap effect. So basically, it seems like just people are dope slapped out of their story, whether it's their depression or whether it's their identity as a smoker. These sort of like narrowed behavioral mental repertoires, people can sort of be knocked out of those narrowed perspectives very powerfully. And it seems like that's the commonality across these disorders. It also seems there's a commonality of emotional processing. Some of our, I didn't show you, but survey work with addiction suggests that when people have spontaneously quit an addictive substance because of a psychedelic, that they often claim substantially less physiological or somatic withdrawal symptoms. Substantially less affective or emotional withdrawal symptoms, even though bodily or somatic withdrawal symptoms are similar to other ways of quitting. Other things we're going to be doing is going into another line of multi-site trials for smoking cessation along the FDA regulatory pathway, with Midison Innovations Group serving as the leading the way and being the sponsor, looking to take this to market for smoking cessation, which is super exciting, and we're super happy to work with them. And also clearly need to explore this for other substance use disorders. We're going to be starting work soon looking at psilocybin for opioid use disorders. So we don't have an answer to that, but as I showed you the older data on heroin addiction, in that one study looked promising, so we're hopeful. Next, please. I believe that might be all. But and next slide. Yep, that's my end slide. So certainly want to thank my colleagues at Hopkins, Al Garcia, Roland Griffiths, Mary Costamano, Elliot Stein, John Fedota, a whole list of other individuals and funding for the smoking cessation research up until this point from philanthropy. And you can certainly learn more about our work at our website, hopkinspsychedelic.org. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, for this fantastic presentation. I have a question. Is it possible that psychedelics can facilitate readiness to change regarding the Prochaska and Di Clemente transferry model?
I believe so. I don't have data to show you on that because we took people that were already at the latter stages. They were, when you call up for a study to quit smoking, I mean, they're treatment seeking, so that by definition they're already, kind of along those stages to, actively, they've got that action plan. Calling up is, that number for that study, quit smoking, is part of an action plan. As I mentioned, Michael Bogenschutz's study kind of took, with alcohol, took patients a step before that were more ambivalent. They didn't necessarily have to have quitting as their goal. They just entered the study to kind of explore potential problems about their drinking. I forget the exact wording, but something more ambiguous like that, where their treatment goals are determined during the process. I think in a study like that, that's where you would be able to pick up more on progressing through stages of changes. I don't recall whether Michael reported anything like that in his pilot study, though. But my impression is, yes, it could help people move along. In fact, that's consistent with the idea that I published some about 4 studies of survey studies of people who have spontaneously quit not just smoking, but also alcohol and cannabis and cocaine and opioids, other drugs. Quit those drugs or substantially reduced because of a psychedelic experience, typically that they were just using at a party or for fun, and then they quit. So in those cases, I think it's correct to conceptualize those people sort of rapidly during those experiences, moving along the stages of change, where people weren't necessarily actively trying to quit, but they're having one of these experiences, and they sort of had this sort of epiphany of why in the world am I smoking, and they quit. And so I think that's by definition moving rapidly along the stages of change.
Okay, thank you. Any question in the audience?
Yeah, thank you for your very nice talk. I wonder if you had data on non-responders, and if knowing the rationale and some of the data that come from the depression field, do you expect that some non-responders would be less on the emotionally vulnerable pathway in terms of processual approach of addiction?
And I'm sorry, I didn't catch enough of that. I know that there was something about differentiating responders from non-responders, but
yeah,
maybe I'm not sure.
My question was, in a processual approach of addiction, we have heterogeneity of patients, which we have with more emotionally vulnerable patients and more patients with less emotionally vulnerable or with less dual disorder rate. And do you expect that among non-responders there would be less patient with a profile, an emotional vulnerable profile, like less depression or
different emotional vulnerability. I don't know. I mean, that would be something interesting to look at as we get larger samples and are able to kind of better look at the correlates of success.
Another question for both speakers.
Well, thank you very much of this presentation. We have the real impression to enter a new world. And all this, you don't speak about cannabinoids, THC or CBD, which is marginally, is there any place for CBD and THC in your psychedelic research? This is my question.
Well, there's different angles you could look at. One angle is that we're going to be doing some work examining if we could use psilocybin to treat a cannabis use disorder. That may not be. I imagine you're imagining more of the cannabinoids as therapeutics. But so because of the anecdotal evidence and survey report we've had, we are interested in doing a trial of psilocybin helping to treat cannabis use disorder. But in terms of using cannabinoids as therapeutics, I think their treatment model is just very different than the treatment model with the classic psychedelics, with psychedelic therapy, with this overwhelming, as David was describing, not something like microdosing, but this large dose where people have an experience that they learn and change from. That seems to be very different than the palliative effects that people benefit from with cannabis for various disorders. But certainly combining different modalities may help. I guess I'm not familiar with any evidence. I mean, I guess there is some interest in cannabis as a substitute drug. So perhaps psychedelics could also use that as a look at that in combination with that with kind of cannabis substitution for alcohol, let's say, as a treatment option. But I'm just speculating there. But I can't think of anything other than that, for connecting to cannabinoids.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. You described these profound life-changing experiences for your patients, but working in addictology, we also see these people with bad trips and psychological problems that persist for many years. Did you find things like that as well? That people get bad trips, that people get psychological problems afterwards? I mean, it can be going good, profound, but it can also be going wrong, huh? Or not, I don't know.
We have not seen evidence of that in our trials, but we have documented, as well have others, these cases. We've done survey work on this where people have been very much harmed in the long term and acutely by psychedelic experiences, and the risk profile there is obviously extremely different, because it's not just in our hands, but really in the older era of psychedelic research, going back to the 50s, or in the modern 20 years of research, really we don't see. I'm not familiar in any research site that it's been reported that someone has, for example, suffered from that a screened participant who's being clinically monitored, has had, for example, instigation of psychotic process or any other sort of long-standing exacerbation of their depression, exacerbation of their anxiety. We've seen this in survey work of people who have bad trips in suboptimal circumstances, part of which might be that unscreened vulnerability. We don't know what vulnerability might have been screened out for various reasons in our research. But this definitely happens. This general risk happens with psychedelics. Fortunately, it's one of those risks that appears to be extremely well mitigated. And with the screening, preparation, monitoring, and clinical oversight procedures that we have at place in these trials. But it's something to continue to look at. And I don't want to say that it's not possible. I mean, if 1 million people are treated, if it's approved as a treatment and 1 million people are treated, even if it's done well, you may get some number of people that end up looking being in this risk category. So we're going to have to keep our eye on that to see what those odds are, what that rate is. I suspect, given what I said about it not happening in the clinical research, I would expect that rate to be pretty low when the treatment is done under these sort of safety guidelines.
Okay, maybe a last question from David.
No, hi Matt. Yeah, anyway, I just want to, good to see you, to maybe add a little bit to it, because I completely agree. So basically I can echo what Matt was saying, that in our studies and generally in the field, when they are conducted in a safe lab environment so far, I mean, knock on wood, it hasn't happened. We haven't had severe adverse effects. People can still, so when we're talking about bad trips, we typically use that term mainly for in an uncontrolled naturalistic environment where people recreationally use these drugs or outside trials or labs. And then it, as Matt is saying, it can go wrong. So when we put a lot of attention to screen and nurture the environment, we haven't seen that. But that doesn't mean we don't see the equivalent of a bad trip within the experience. We see very challenging experiences, and we are trying in a way to be a bit more in depth about how we characterize the experience in our trials. So instead of we just have one rating coming from, oh, it was this profound, when we also try to tap in and develop new tools to, for instance, go into the sort of emotional breakthrough coming through the experience. But it might be that it is quite challenging early on or partly at some point during the therapy session. But then we are trying to understand what does that mean and how can people sort of break through that during these hours that the drug is lasting. And another thing that hopefully, and I imagine that Matt will agree, that first we have done these very small proof of concept trials where they are very constrained. There might be more flexibility possible to build into trials in the future where we can, we already try to do that. So if people are really struggling during the experience, we try to have flexibility in offering more integration work afterwards, so we can add in more psychology after the experience. Because I think that when people are really struggling, if the context is very unsafe, it's not supported, there's not any psychological work done afterwards to catch it, to work through it, to work with that experience, and to land it somewhere psychologically, that's where people are quite traumatized. And that is what we are desperately trying to avoid in the labs, and so far successfully avoiding. But as Matt is also saying, when you scale it up, there will be some, most likely at some point, when you do enough people, that will get a proper adverse event also on a trial, if you do it in the many thousands. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I agree with all of what David said.
Okay, it's time to close this session. Thank you for the speakers.